This is Newswatch with Richard Cartwright.
Tonight's main story is the Foreign Secretary reveals Britain and Spain have reached broad agreement for the joint sovereignty of Gibraltar. Here, the news is received with anger, with political parties and the public at large accusing the British government of betrayal. And locally, company taxation is reformed. Good evening. The Foreign Secretary has revealed that Britain and Spain have reached broad agreement for the joint sovereignty of Gibraltar. Jack Straw gave the information during a statement in the House of Commons this afternoon, through which he informed MPs of the latest developments arising out of the Anglo-Spanish talks on the future of the ROC.
Jack Straw took the opportunity to give his statement after not having had to travel to Madrid for today's postponed Brussels process talks. He said the negotiations were in two phases, with the first still needed to be completed in order to arrive at a framework of principles to be subsequently negotiated further in phase two with the Gibraltar government. The conclusions, in the form of a new treaty for the ROC, would then be put to referendum and only implemented if accepted by a majority of voters. The Foreign Secretary revealed there were several areas on which there was already broad agreement. Significantly, the much-feared concept of joint sovereignty has been agreed, with the United Kingdom for the first time in 300 years having accepted to relinquish part of its sovereignty over the ROC.
That Britain and Spain should share sovereignty over Gibraltar, including the disputed territory of the Isthmus. Gibraltar should have more internal self-government. Gibraltar should retain its British traditions, customs and way of life. Gibraltarians should retain the right to British nationality and would gain, in addition, the right to Spanish nationality as well. Gibraltar should retain its institutions, its government, House of Assembly, courts and police service. Gibraltar could, if it chose, participate fully in the European Union single market.
Mr. Secretary Straw.
Gibraltar could, if it chose, participate fully in the European Union single market and other EU arrangements.
The Foreign Secretary also said difficulties still remain, which will determine whether or not the agreement is concluded or not.
We in Spain have not yet resolved all differences. In respect of the duration of co-sovereignty, we must have a permanent settlement. Co-sovereignty cannot be just a stepping stone, however long delayed, to full Spanish sovereignty. I know and understand that Spain has a long-standing historical aspiration to regain full sovereignty one day. But the agreement, any agreement, which we and Spain enter into, has to be permanent. Gibraltar has to have certainty. And in respect of British military facilities, we've made clear that our current arrangements should continue. Madam Deputy Speaker, unless we and Spain can resolve the outstanding issues, then plainly there will be no agreement. Our aim, however, remains to overcome these, if we can. We must remember that Spain too has interests. They too have politics. They too have history. And the departing Spanish Foreign Minister, Josep Piqué, has conducted these negotiations throughout with honesty, dignity and integrity, and I pay tribute to him.
Jack Straw said that if a deal is struck, it'll offer the Gibraltarians a great prize, which would afford them a great freedom to take decisions on their lives. It would also allow them to live, work and travel without constraints anywhere in the region and beyond. He said the agreement would amount to the preservation of Gibraltar's links with Britain while also developing a new relationship with Spain. An hour-long debate ensued, with this opened by the Shadow Foreign Secretary Michael Ancram, who described Mr. Straw's statement as a disgrace. The Conservative spokesman said his party had long feared that the joint sovereignty of Gibraltar was being cooked up, with today's comments just another step in what has been from the start a shabby and dishonourable process. Mr. Ancram considered that right from the start, the Minister for Europe, Peter Hain, had sought to bully and intimidate the government and people of Gibraltar, and this has continued in this latest statement. He also had strong words for Mr. Straw.
Will he not accept that these talks have been a humiliating episode for his government? He has actually achieved the impossible. He's upset the Spaniards, he's infuriated the people of Gibraltar, he's shamed himself and his government, and at the same time he has got nothing to show for it at all. Will he now stop playing with Gibraltar's sovereignty, call off the talks, start repaying the loyalty of the people of Gibraltar to Britain by demonstrating a little loyalty to them in return?
The There were many other speakers to follow, a large majority of whom told the Foreign Secretary they did not support the British government's policy on Gibraltar. You can see the debate in full immediately after our 11 o'clock transmission of this programme.
And this evening, the Governor, David Dury, has underlined that the solution under the discussion does not seek to cut the ties between Gibraltar and Britain. In a statement, he says the UK wants to retain the link with the Rock as much as Gibraltarians want to retain it with Britain. The Governor emphasises that the Foreign Secretary has made clear he wants a secure future for the Rock and that a settlement of the dispute with Spain would be in both Gibraltar's and Britain's interests. He's made it a point of stressing that there'll only be an agreement between Britain and Spain if all the outstanding issues can be overcome, and that if there is an agreement, it can only be implemented if the people of Gibraltar agree with it. The statement from the Command refers to the Foreign Secretary as having underlined he wants a solution which will be good for Gibraltar. David Dury considers that that is what politicians here, as well as the population as a whole, want too. However, he acknowledges the difficulty that exists in finding a solution acceptable to all sides. As a result, the Governor has called upon anyone who may think there are elements that can be improved and which could lead to a solution that's acceptable to all to put them forward to the local government. Mr. Dury is of the view that it's important for there to be dialogue between the British and Gibraltar governments. The Chief Minister has reacted angrily to the Foreign Secretary's statement. Speaking on Radio Gibraltar's Focus at Lunchtime programme today, Peter Caruana said that what the British government had done was issue a declaration of principles, which is precisely what Gibraltar had been asking him not to do. He added that the British concession on joint sovereignty, which will stand for all time, is a most regrettable and most damaging position in which to place Gibraltar, while amounting to a betrayal of its people's rights. And the government has also condemned the statement issued this evening by the Governor. Well, Mr. Caruana joins me now in the studio to discuss these matters further. First of all, good evening, Mr. Caruana. The statement by the Governor, is that an unusual statement to make, do you think, in your mind?
Well, we have rejected and condemned it primarily as an unacceptable interference by the Governor in local politics. He has, first of all, distorted the political significance of Mr. Straw's statement by not even mentioning the fact, indeed in his statement appearing to give the contrary impression, that Mr. Straw has now said that he has agreed the principle of joint sovereignty with Spain. He is in effect joining issue, he is in effect directly challenging in public the Gibraltar government's policy opposition to a declaration of principles which predetermines our sovereignty rights. He has called on people in Gibraltar to suggest improvements to the what I'm now calling the Westminster Declaration. It's not a question of improving. You cannot improve something which is based on a fundamental principle which is unacceptable to the people of Gibraltar, and that is joint sovereignty.
And what do you think he's getting at when he's saying that people should come forward if they have new ideas? What's the underlying feeling there?
I mean, for a governor of Gibraltar to say, if you think that there are elements that can be improved and which could lead to a solution acceptable to all, I hope that you will put them forward to your government. It is important that there should be dialogue between the British government and the government of Gibraltar, is an attempt to get people to embroil the Gibraltar government in talks with the British government on the basis outlined in the Westminster Declaration, which is based on the principle of joint sovereignty, and the Gibraltar government will not do that. I think it is regrettable, deeply regrettable, that the Governor should have issued a statement which in effect converts him into the Foreign Office spokesman in Gibraltar.
And the other matter further afield in the UK, you call the British government on the radio today as inept. Presumably you call them deaf as well, because they're not listening to what you've asked them to do.
Well, let's be clear that during the last several months, the government and people of Gibraltar have been engaged in a political campaign to say to the British government, look, we're willing to take part in reasonable dialogue, but we're opposed to your making, in principle, sovereignty concessions to Spain. The placard at the front of the demonstration on the 18th of March was no in-principle concessions against our wishes, yes to reasonable dialogue.
But again, it's gone in one ear and out the other.
Absolutely. Mr. Straw has ignored the Gibraltar government's request, has ignored the wishes and requests of the people of Gibraltar, and has unilaterally delivered to Spain precisely a declaration of principle on joint sovereignty. And look, he hasn't even obtained Spain's agreement in response. In other words, we would still have objected to it. But if Mr. Straw at least had said, I have reached an agreement with Spain and it involves joint sovereignty, well, look, we would still have objected bitterly. But in effect, what he has done is without Spain agreeing, in other words, in the context of a failure to reach agreement, he has delivered to Spain the political recognition of the in-principle concession on sovereignty, which is the most that Spain could have hoped to have achieved from a joint declaration and from an agreement if they had reached it. We have been severely prejudiced in terms of our right to self-determination, our right to decide our own future. Any future dialogue has now been predetermined to result in joint sovereignty between the UK and Spain over Gibraltar. The government of Gibraltar has made it perfectly clear we would not take part in dialogue which was predetermined to result in joint or any other form of Spanish sovereignty over Gibraltar. We therefore will not, cannot and will not take part in dialogue under Mr. Straw's Westminster Declaration.
In the day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year, if you like, life of the Gibraltarian, what is joint sovereignty?
Well, first of all, there is so much spin and so much nuance in all of these statements and political positions. And the first thing I want to say, really for the peace of mind, particularly of elderly people in Gibraltar who just see headlines and get worried, there is no prospect of physical implementation of any agreement that gives any share of sovereignty to Spain or any role to Spain in our affairs unless the people of Gibraltar approve it in a referendum. That is not what is at stake here. That is not in danger of happening here, because for that we have a referendum. What has happened is that the British government for the first time has, first of all, accepted that it has agreed with Spain to share the sovereignty of Gibraltar, and secondly, has referred to the isthmus as a disputed territory. That is also new and prejudicial. The British government has never referred to the isthmus as a disputed territory.
And
the British government's
Spain
position has always been that its sovereignty over the territory is clear. What does, in answer to your question, what does joint sovereignty mean? Well, look, joint sovereignty means, if sovereignty means anything, it means one of two things. It means allegiance, affinity, sense of belonging to. And what we're going to be invited is to accept that we must have those allegiances both to Spain and to Britain. And the other aspect of the meaning of sovereignty is ultimate authority, right to participate in the affairs of the territory. And I don't believe that the people of Gibraltar are ready to give Spain a share in either of those two definitions of sovereignty. The point is that the people of Gibraltar are no more willing to share their sovereignty with Spain than the people of Britain are willing to share the sovereignty of Britain with France. It's nothing that needs to be justified.
I think many people thought that there'd be a bit of a hiatus now because the José Piqué left and Ana Palacio is in. So let me set a multiple scenario. That is that some say, stop Brussels now. Others say, get on with the constitutional proposals. And others, like the governor, say that this government, your administration, as well as other administrations, have been backward in coming forward, if you like, with coming up with fresh ideas. Which do you choose?
Well, I don't choose any of them. Look, the government of Gibraltar has spent 6 years engaged in dialogue with the British government to try and get terms for participation by Gibraltar in safe and reasonable dialogue with Spain. Those two conditions are well known: our own separate voice and no agreements at those talks over the head of the Gibraltar government. We now know why the British government has refused to give the second condition, because if we had been at the dialogue with our second condition, Mr. Straw could not have broadly agreed with Spain the principle of joint sovereignty. I think it is right that Gibraltar should take part safely, on the right terms and conditions, in open agenda dialogue with Spain. What is wrong, unacceptable, and will not happen is that Gibraltar should be expected to take part in dialogue with Spain, the outcome of which has been predetermined by Mr. Straw to result in joint sovereignty. And no amount of suggestions that the governor invites people in Gibraltar to put is going to alter that fact unless Mr. Straw himself is willing to alter it. The fact of the matter is that in the knowledge that it is against the wishes of the people of Gibraltar, Mr. Straw has made a very damaging concession to Spain over the sovereignty of Gibraltar. And what is even more annoying is that he has made it gratuitously, unnecessarily, because he says that he will not make an agreement with Spain unless Spain renounces its full sovereignty claim. There is no chance of that happening. Therefore, they're not going to be able to reach an agreement. So therefore, why give Spain this sovereignty concession?
Very briefly, Chief Minister, and I mean briefly, Jack Straw has said it. He's now said it. So what are you going to do with your anger now?
Well, it's the government of Gibraltar is now going to engage in a process of wide consultation within Gibraltar before we come out with a formal response and next phase of plan of action. I previously expressed the view that if there was a concession made on the principles of sovereignty, the Gibraltar government would call a referendum. So that obviously is a very real prospect in the context of Mr. Straw's new Westminster Declaration. But there will be a process of wide consultation, and I expect that the government during the next few days will come out with a formal and considered response. In the meantime, the government of Gibraltar condemns both Mr. Straw's in-principle sovereignty concession, which is a betrayal and violation of our rights as a people to decide our own future, highly damaging to our political rights and aspirations as a people, and the Gibraltar government condemns the governor's intervention in this respect in a way which, as I said before, makes him a spokesman for the Foreign Office.
Chief Minister, thank you for talking to us tonight. For its part, the opposition has condemned Jack Straw's statement. It considers a base betrayal of the wishes and aspirations of the people of Gibraltar and of our right to self-determination that the British government is willing to share the sovereignty of Gibraltar with Spain. The alliance reiterates that the only way to stop this is to put an end to the Brussels negotiating process once and for all. Christine Podesta spoke to the opposition leader, Joe Bossano.
One important thing from our perspective, given that we've always been opposed to the Brussels process, is that Jack Straw has spelled out in no uncertain terms that from the beginning, the only way to solve the dispute under the so-called Brussels process was linking the things that matter to Gibraltar with the thing that matters to Spain, which is sovereignty. Spain has always made clear from the day of the Moran proposals that there had to be parallel progress, in inverted commas, between the issues of cooperation and the issues of sovereignty. And consequently, the idea that there is a thing called reasonable dialogue, where we just talk about friendly, neighborly relations without making concessions on sovereignty, is simply not possible under Brussels. Secondly, by listing the elements of the new framework with which we are familiar from what has been filtered out previously, in a way which says there is now broad in principle agreement with Spain, but saying it in a ministerial statement in Parliament, it is a statement of government policy. And therefore, it puts on a more formal footing the willingness of the British government to share the sovereignty of Gibraltar with Spain. There is still the caveat that if the so-called elements like the treatment of the military bases, which the UK wants, and the relinquishing of the Spanish claim for total sovereignty, which the UK wants, do not materialize, the framework will not be done. And that if the framework is done, the detailed proposals will only happen if a Gibraltar government, the one that is there, certainly not anyone led by me, would participate to flesh out that framework and put in the proposals, which would then go to a referendum. All that we knew. But I think what is new is, first of all, that almost everywhere in the international press, the process was being written off. And everybody was expressing the view that we had been successful in derailing it, and that therefore Spain had come out of this with egg on their face. The position was that Spain was saying to UK unless there are concrete results from the next round of Brussels. Relations between UK and Spain are going to deteriorate. And I think Senor Aznar, to protect himself in Spain, will now be able to say, well, look, without giving anything in exchange, we have already got under our belt a public policy statement of the UK government of their willingness to share sovereignty.
Well, in Parliament today, Jack Straw has said that this must be a permanent solution. So are we led to believe by this that Spain has agreed to relinquish her claim to full sovereignty?
No. In fact, he made clear in the statement that Spain has not agreed to that. But perhaps I can remind you that at one stage when it surfaced that this was a problem, the Foreign Office stopped talking about relinquishing the claim and started talking about the agreement being durable instead of being indefinite. And we know from past experience how they massage words so that they can mean one thing to one side and something else to the other. If they want to pull this off, the way to do it would be something that allows the British government to argue that Spain is not going to push its claim, and allows Spain to argue that, okay, not pushing it doesn't mean giving it up. But the stage at which we are now is that Spain has gained diplomatic and negotiating ground without having given up anything at all so far, not even its claim for 100%, that the British government has indicated a willingness to make concessions to Spain, which certainly would not augur well for putting any confidence in their holding Spain to anything that is agreed. I mean, all that we need to ask ourselves, if we were stupid enough to swallow a joint deal with Spain, how could we trust a British government that wants to pull out to keep Spain to the letter of what is agreed when they're not doing it now? This is what I've been saying in the 20-odd interviews I've been given today to British media. How could anybody in Gibraltar rely on the Foreign Office to protect us in a half-Spanish Gibraltar when they don't protect us in a 100% British Gibraltar?
Well, only last week Giuseppe Piquet was saying that he was angry at Britain for asking the Gibraltarians his opinion and that Spain would not recognise the results of a referendum. So how do you reconcile this with the referendum being held now?
Look, the referendum is not going to happen because, look, this is a very long way away. The referendum first requires that the framework agreement should be agreed, including the question of the military bases, and then that a Gibraltar government should participate in the new framework to give the input of what has to go to the referendum. I have to say that I think Mr. Caruana is talking again about a referendum now. Well, I don't see how he can go to a referendum on a statement made by the British government. There isn't even an agreement between Spain and UK at the moment to put to a referendum. The reality of it is that I think now Mr. Caruana should finally accept that in the light of the latest statement, it is simply impossible to continue to support the Brussels process. And if need be, let's have a referendum on whether we want negotiations under Brussels to continue or not.
And reacting to the governor's statements, the opposition leader says it's an absolute scandal that the governor should take on the role of apologist for the Foreign Office's policies. Joe Bossano said his role was to transmit the views and wishes of the people of Gibraltar to the Foreign Office so that these could be taken into account. The opposition leader says the governor's statement undermines the neutrality and independence of his position as representative of the Queen. He added the statement could have been made by any Mandarin in the Foreign Office. Meanwhile, the Liberals have sent an urgent circular denouncing the actions of the British government to their Liberal contacts all over the world. The Liberal leader has explained how the statement contradicts Liberal values on human rights and Liberal thinking on the right of the people to decide freely and without pressure what they want to be. The circular has been sent to Liberal parliamentarians and politicians from a database of contacts compiled as a result of lobbying for more than 10 years. In the circular, Dr. Jose Garcia points out that the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights make it clear that the right to self-determination of a colonial people must be paramount. He recalls that several Liberal movements have adopted resolutions in support of self-determination for Gibraltar. The Liberal leader highlighted the seriousness of the situation since it's the first time the UK has looked to Spain instead of the Gibraltarians for the decolonisation of the rock. Jose Garcia explained how the latest developments serve as further proof that the negotiating process has a predetermined outcome. For its part, the Liberal Forum considered Jack Straw's statement to be an appalling act of betrayal and a direct insult to every Gibraltarian as well as a slap in the face to all the rock's friends in Britain. The ILEF consider it's nonsense to suggest the Anglo-Spanish agreement is the only way forward. The party questions why, if the Foreign Secretary is so confident, he chose to make his statement on Friday morning, knowing there are very few MPs in the House. The independent Liberals have stated the betrayal of principle announced today removes every vestige of democratic credibility the new Labour government might have had. And the Labour Party has described Jack Straw's statement as an absolute disgrace and wholly inept. If it's designed to bring a lasting settlement to Gibraltar. Spokesman Daniel Feetham considers the statement is in some respects worse than an actual declaration of principles, given that at least Spain would have been bound by it. As a result, he feels Mr. Straw has made immense public concessions, with Spain gaining much but giving nothing in return at all. Additionally, the spokesman says the statement will now constitute a baseline from which Spain will attempt to extract further concessions from the UK government. Labour is also of the view that those wishing a settlement lose out because even they find joint sovereignty unacceptable. The party considers Jack Straw has made it impossible for any of the major parties in Spain to accept joint sovereignty in perpetuity, let alone anything less than that. The Labour Party is also of the view that in the light of the statement, the British government will not allow Gibraltar to decolonise through constitutional reform. So Daniel Feetham considers legal action has now become the only option for Gibraltar, which must be exercised. And the Voice of Gibraltar group staged a loud protest outside the Convent this morning. A crowd of around 30 gathered with placards condemning the Brussels process. A group of around 10 later moved to the MOD naval base, where they blocked access to all MOD vehicles. It was during the first of their protests today that Jack Straw announced that Britain is prepared to share sovereignty with Spain.
The Voice of Gibraltar group believes enough is enough, and today opted not to keep quiet. For the past year, they've held silent protests coinciding with talks, whether they be in London or Barcelona. But today, members of the VOGG portrayed their anger and disapproval loud and clear. Group members and supporters whistled, used kitchen utensils, and urged drivers to hoot whilst driving past. As long as it was noise, anything goes, was the view of those protesting. During lunchtime, a radio was brought to the area, with many listening attentively as Radio Gibraltar's Focus at Lunchtime programme broke the latest developments.
Jack Straw took the opportunity to give his statement after not having had to travel to Madrid for today's postponed Brussels process talks. He said the negotiations were in...
As with most protests, security around the convent was reinforced, with officers guarding the entrance to the governor's residence. Even the traditional changing of the guard was kept a quiet affair during the protest. Meanwhile, tension rose as criticism against the British government's decision flew from corner to corner.
I think Jack Straw is trying to show a bit of bravado, and we are prepared to take up the challenge. If he wants to show bravado, so is Gibraltar. I think it's quite disgraceful that after so many years on national days saying to the whole world basically, but particularly to the politicians that matter as far as we are concerned, sovereignty is not negotiable. Sovereignty is not negotiable. Sovereignty is not negotiable. So what are they doing? Not only discussing, negotiating sovereignty, but actually putting it on a plate for Spain to say, okay.
Is the announcement, in your opinion, confirmation that Britain has betrayed the people of Gibraltar?
Not Britain, but people like Blair, Straw and Peter Hain. I think we have a lot of friends in Britain, and we are gaining more and more support from the MPs, which is extremely important. I think if Jack Straw doesn't watch it, he might also get knocked out, as Piquet has been recently, out of the Foreign Office.
Well, in a past interview with GBC, you said that the Spanish flag will fly over the Rock of Gibraltar, over your dead body, but it seems now that the Spanish flag could someday fly over Gibraltar.
The Spanish flag will not fly over Gibraltar, not only over my dead body, but over the dead body of the present generation, of the generation after us, and of future generations, as long as we the people do not wish it to fly.
And how do you think that Gibraltarians will take to the news?
I think the people of Gibraltar have been partly prepared for this, but I think the people of Gibraltar and our politicians, particularly those who favour some kind of continuation of Brussels, insofar as certain conditions must be met. I think it must be clear to all of us now that Brussels means negotiation of our sovereignty, and Jack Straw has made that point today. What they are doing through the Brussels process is negotiating our sovereignty, and that is a betrayal of our birthright.
Placards condemned the Brussels process, and flyers reminded Gibraltar it was time for a wake-up call. It told people that our birthright is at stake and no one on the rock will be threatened, bullied, bribed, bought or sold. But the morning was dominated by disappointment. This was clear on people's faces as they heard radio news. Leader of the opposition, Joe Bossano, was also at the scene. He made his way there as soon as he heard the news. Meanwhile, in a spontaneous move after the convent demo at 2, a group of around 10 moved to the MOD naval base, where they blocked access to all MOD vehicles. In fact, they were successful in stopping one of the vehicles. Apparently the first time in over 200 years that civilians have had such control at the naval base. They refused to move until received by a senior rank. At approximately 4:15 this afternoon, their request was seen to, and Willie Serfati and Joey Gabay were shown into the tower and received by Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, who's acting for the Commander British Forces. The Voice of Gibraltar explained to him that since the military base is one of the British government's so-called red lines, they saw it fit to demonstrate there. Joey Gabay told him that Jack Straw's statement today had broken the balance of coexistence with the Ministry of Defence, and warned that the Voice of Gibraltar will use the military base as a tool to protect Gibraltar's interests. Mr. Gabay said morale was high and that this was only a preview of protests to come if the UK continues with its current line in negotiations. He also asked for the message to be conveyed to Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon. The crowd dispersed at 4:45. Today's protest here outside the convent was originally scheduled to coincide with today's round of talks in Madrid, and even though those were postponed, this protest went ahead. But it was few who could expect the announcement by Jack Straw that Britain is prepared to share sovereignty with Spain. There's been wide criticism of the Foreign Secretary and of Prime Minister Tony Blair here today, but the VOGG has been clear. Their campaign continues. Gibraltar will fight to the very end.
James Nish with that report. The organiser of the Keep Gibraltar campaign in Plymouth, Kevin Kelway, believes there is 99% support for the rock in Britain. Over 60 members of the Golden Hind Gibraltar Association in Plymouth have braved wet and wintry conditions to stage a silent vigil for over 11 hours at the Sir Francis Drake Monument in the city. Military personnel participating in Navy Day parades and who have served on the rock joined in the protest and pledged their support. Miniature beacons have been lit on the historic spot where over 400 years ago another Spanish claim was defeated in the Armada, with the first lit by Sir Francis Drake, Lady Drake, in period costume. The vigil continued overnight, through which the Plymouth campaigners again warned the rest of Britain that another Spanish invasion is happening in respect of the rock.
I can't understand why this is going on in the first place. After my 4-day visit to Gibraltar, I discovered so much about some of the bully boy tactics going on by the Spanish in Gibraltar, with telephone exchanges and not letting athletes from Gibraltar compete in various organisations. I just can't believe that, as an Englishman myself, but very proud of being British also, that our British government will actually let another foreign power get away with these tactics. I know I'm speaking pretty angrily, but I feel so passionate about it, and I feel that other people in this country, should actually be doing what we're doing as well, and saying to the British and Spanish governments that Gibraltar is British, that they're going to defend your sort of way of life and your identity, and that how dare you, stop, freedom of expression and your self-determination to decide your own future. And that's what our protest was all about.
And the vigil in Plymouth ended at 11 this morning to the sounds of noisy whistles. This linked up appropriately with a loud protest organised by the Voice of Gibraltar group on the rock. Ramon de Miguel is to continue occupying the post of Spanish Minister for Europe. This has been confirmed by the new Foreign Minister Ana de Palacio. Senor de Miguel has led the negotiations on Gibraltar together with his British counterpart Peter Hain, with his reappointment signalling a continuation of the Spanish policy. Senora de Palacio has nonetheless admitted that it will be impossible to reach an agreement on the future of the rock before the summer, but has assured the negotiations will continue after the holiday period. The minister rejected any talk of the talks having failed, adding the latest events had simply meant a change in her diary. The president of the Andalusian regional government, Manuel Chavez, has demanded that the Spanish government and the new Foreign Affairs Minister, Ana de Palacio, to give explanations as to why the negotiations over Gibraltar have ended in what he describes as absolute failure. Senor Chavez considers this absolutely necessary, since the talks had been hyped up to the extent of a virtual assurance that a deal for the future of the rock would be struck between Spain and the UK. He added that given the outcome, the central government perhaps expressed such optimism for political capital and electoral purposes. The Andalusian president has expressed the view that even if the negotiations have been frozen, this should not stop the strengthening of human relations at a cultural, economic, education and health level across the border. Manuel Chavez considers increased cooperation could make easier future agreements. Morocco unexpectedly invaded a small rocky outcrop 6 miles off the Spanish enclave of Ceuta and claimed it to be its own, despite the island being officially Spanish territory. Isla Perejil in the Strait of Gibraltar is uninhabited, with its sovereignty disputed by Rabat. Moroccan troops landed there yesterday, hoisting their national flag. They later declined to leave when approached by the Spanish Civil Guard, with Madrid deploying 2 naval gunboats as well as another Civil Guard vessel. Today the standoff continues. In Madrid, Defense and Foreign Ministry officials have discussed the crisis with the Prime Minister José María Aznar, the government demanding the military withdrawal from the island, which was taken by Spain in 1808, even if it's actually in Moroccan waters. Rabat says it intends to set up a lookout post on Isla Perejil, which Morocco calls Leila. Officials say its purpose is for anti-terrorist and illegal immigration operations. However, the military landing follows increasing pressure from Morocco for Madrid to return Ceuta and Melilla, especially now that Spain is itself demanding the return of Gibraltar from the United Kingdom. We'll bring you more of today's local stories when Newswatch returns in a couple of minutes. Among the items after the break, we'll give you details of the reforms to company taxation announced by the Chief Minister today in the House of Assembly. Stay with us.
Jib Telecom, the shape of things to come.
Welcome back. The Chief Minister has given details of